Well, Let the Children Come is about a call to churches to do everything they can to protect children, both within our own families, as well as within the church, as well as in the communities in which we live, work, volunteer, and play. I see that the church has a very powerful role that they can play in protecting children. And the church, unfortunately, in my experience, is in denial about child abuse. And they tell me we're good people here, it doesn't happen here. And yet I'm hearing from so many survivors and victims of abuse saying, yes, it does happen here. And in fact, they're saying the church sometimes re-victimizes us by not responding, by not listening. And so I am trying to raise awareness in the church to say, hey, child abuse does exist both within your church community as well as in your neighborhoods where it is that you go home to live. And we need to be protecting children in all of those places. And I feel that that is what Jesus is calling us to do when he says, let the children come. I don't know if it's more of a problem, but I do know that churches, by our mission, is that we are open to everybody who comes to us. And because our doors are always open, and that is part of, like I said, part of our mission is to be welcoming to people. Sometimes we don't realize that when we welcome these people, we also need to be working to protect those amongst us who are vulnerable. And so I think that puts us in an awkward spot. Well, I was raised in a loving Mennonite family. We always were safe. We always had enough to eat. We always had a roof over our head. And so that was just by good luck that I was born into a family like that, and that God blessed me with a family that was whole and that I could be nurtured and grow up in. As I became a social worker and began to work with families who had abused their children, I just came to love them and to see the plight that they were in, just being so isolated and so very stressed. And I'm thinking myself in those situations would also perhaps have not been the acting the best toward my children. And so just seeing their plight and trying to bring together my career as a social worker, as well as my profession, my faith as a Mennonite and as a Christian, I wanted to bring those together. And so it was through that then that I was invited by my church to teach a Sunday school class on the role of the church in preventing child abuse. As I was looking around for a curriculum, looking for a book, anything that I could use to teach that class, I really wasn't finding anything close to what I was looking for. And so I began to write the material. And so it was out of the writing of that material then that my church encouraged me to go ahead and take the next step and perhaps provide this resource to other churches as well. So that was about 5 years ago. In March of 7, I intentionally stranded myself at the university during a huge snowstorm and wrote my proposal for the book, which was then accepted by Mennonite Publishing Network. And so then I proceeded to write the manuscript, which took longer than I had hoped. There was a lot of research to do along the way, and a lot of interviews, and a lot of thought to go into it. I also did a lot of work with churches along the way. And so then the book finally came to fruition in just a couple of months ago. I hope for the church to be, as I said, to become more aware of their power that they have to be able to protect children. And so the message that I am giving to churches is really three. One is that the church is a very important part to play in protecting children from all types of child abuse and neglect, not just sexual abuse. I think the church is particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse and accusations there, but we also have a role to play in physical abuse and emotional abuse and neglect. And in fact, more than half of our children in our country who are dying are from neglect. I'm saying the church must have a part to play in protecting those children. My second point that I'm trying to make to churches is that the church has an important part to play in protecting children in all places that we encounter them. So in our own families, as well as in our church programming, and our church programming sometimes extends the walls of our buildings, and so as our youth groups go out to campouts and retreats and things like that, we still need to be mindful of keeping kids safe. But then we also a church needs to protect kids everywhere that they live, they work, they volunteer, and they play. So they go out, and there are children in all of those places as well, and we have a responsibility to share God's love with them and to make sure that we can do everything we can to keep them safe. Then my third point that I'm making to churches is that it's not the church's job alone. We need to be collaborating better with community organizations. And so whether that is Child Protective Services or the police, whether that's nonprofits that are serving families, whether that's participating with faith-based counseling agencies, that we need to be working together, because there's things the church should be doing and things the church should not be doing. And I want them to know what their role is and move them to action. And when they're going outside, what their really is their expertise. Like, they should not be interviewing children, should not be investigating, should not be trying to figure out how to intervene with domestic violence and mental illness and substance abuse. Those are problems that are too complex, I think, for the church to handle on their own. So I want the church and the community organizations to be finding ways to work together and build those relationships so that they can be equipped to prepare to protect children. This issue is important for our places of faith for many reasons. For one, we're followers of Jesus, and we need to follow his example when he says, "Let the children come." And he held the children in high esteem in a society that did not. And I think we as Christians need to also to respect and hold our children dear and to uphold their values, their skills, their talents, and all that they have to offer, so that as they grow up in the faith, they can continue to be part of our church, and they can know that the church is a safe place and a place where they can be held dear and their skills and talents can be used. Too many families are honestly telling me that churches are not a safe place and they will never bring their child there. And I do not want that to be the case for any of our churches. It really is, and I really uphold the Catholic Church, and they have been mandated to move to a place where they are now protecting children. They have policies, they're doing background checks, they're doing trainings, they're doing so many wonderful things to protect children now. Now it's the turn for the Mennonite Church and the Protestant Church to also come forth, because all of the headlines that I'm finding in the newspapers right now are about Protestant churches and non-denominational churches, and that's where the abuse is occurring. And I think we're in big-time denial that is going on. So it is our turn to rise up before we ever have to be mandated or have to hit our churches in the headlines too often. We need to step forth now before another child has to be hurt. One of the things that has come out of writing the manuscript for this book was bringing me together with other Mennonites and other Christians who are also working to prevent child abuse and neglect, particularly in the church. So through that activity, we have now formed the Dove's Nest Collaborative. So we formed that in 2009, and that is, the byline is Mennonites Keeping Children Safe. And so we are working hard to raise awareness in churches and to, more than anything, make sure that our churches have child protection policies, that we have written them, adopted them, and then we're also implementing them consistently so that our churches are being intentional about keeping our kids safe. What I am hearing is that if a church does not have a policy, they can certainly be held liable if a child were to be hurt. If they have a policy and they don't implement it, it's even worse off for them, because then they knew better and they didn't act to keep the children safe. And so included in that child protection policy then needs to be a response. What are we going to do if we do suspect child abuse and neglect? Who is going to report it? Who are we going to tell? Also, what's going to be our response if someone shows up and says, "Hey, I have offended sexually against children in the past, but I want to be a part of your congregation. How is it that I can come and be a part of your church?" And the church needs to be ready to be able to respond and be able to say, "Yes, you can be a part of our congregation, but these are the rules you're going to get to follow, because first and foremost, our children must be kept safe." So that's one of the things I'm hearing the most from churches, is saying, how is it that we can be welcoming to everyone? Knowing that people with sex offense history are already visiting at churches, are already part of our congregation, and we don't even know it. When we do know it, how are we going to make sure that our kids, or all of the time, how are we going to make sure that our kids are safe? There's a lot of things that can go into a church protection policy. For one, I want everybody in the congregation, adults and children alike, to be aware to be able to know what are the signs and what are the risk and protective factors for child abuse and neglect, so that when a child does need help, we'll be ready to hear their outcry. We'll be able to see it, we'll be able to smell it, we'll be able to pick it up, and we won't be in a place of denial where we won't be able to respond. So I want the whole church to be aware of child abuse and neglect. I want us to include it in our worship, to be intentional about it at least once a year, to be talking about child abuse and neglect during our time of worship. So it's during the sermon, during children's story, with responsive readings. And we have all of those kinds of resources available on the Dove's Nest website, so churches can do that. We also have examples of child protection policies that churches can use and adapt to their own specific situation. Many other things churches can do is to make sure that an adult is never alone with a child, so it's called the 2-adult rule. Also, of course, wanting to have windows on the insides on the interior walls, in the doors or in the walls, so that no place in our church is ever a private space that children will ever be finding themselves vulnerable to being alone with an individual. Absolutely, yeah. We need to have a window in every Sunday school room. If our facilities don't allow us to do that because we're an older building or we don't, for whatever reason, we can leave the doors cracked open, and just always making sure that maybe then if somebody were to walk by, that we would always have nothing to hide. It doesn't mean we can't have private conversations with children or youth. We just need to make sure those are in places that other people can still observe that something is going on, so they can see that things are. It is safe for everybody. Of course not. Yeah, we need to have, our child protection practices need to be multifaceted. We want to be having our people who are teaching children, whether they're staff or volunteers, we want to have background checks on them. We want to be able to know these people well, so they need to have been part of our congregation for at least 6 months before they are working and supervising, teaching our children. But that alone doesn't do it, because as we know, many people never, for a long time, do not get convicted of sexual offense if that is the type of abuse that's going on. And so we need to also have the 2-adult rule. And then we also need to have the training, and hopefully by that comprehensive approach to child protection, that our kids then can be kept safe. It's important to know our children well and to be able to see when behaviors change. So if there is a sudden change in behavior for a child, that suddenly one who is very outgoing suddenly is very quiet and very withdrawn, or maybe a child that had been more quiet suddenly becomes very aggressive or very destructive even to others. Anytime there's a drastic change in behavior, we really need to watch and see, what is going on for that child in their environment, in their home, in their school, in their neighborhood. Also, we need to be, if children begin to say things like repeatedly about not wanting to go home or not wanting to be in somebody's presence, we need to respect that. Too often I see parents scooping up their children and saying, "Here, kiss this person, Auntie so-and-so," or throws them in the lap of somebody else, and the child is squirming and saying, no, they don't want to be a part of that kind of close encounter. We need to respect our children's wishes, and if they say, "No, I don't want to be hugged by," or "I don't want to kiss somebody," we really need to respect our children and help them to see that their body is sacred, and they can make choices about keeping safe, and we should not just thrust them into other places. It's different in every region as to whether the insurance companies are requiring churches to be able to have a child protection policy. I would like churches to rise up and to have those policies, even if it's not required of them, but especially if it is, we need to make sure those policies then are comprehensive and that we are actually implementing them as well. But it can reduce insurance rates, but I would like churches to be doing it for the sake of protecting children and not for being able to save money. I'm hoping that the church will acknowledge that families come in many different constellations. They have throughout our history, even as we look back to biblical times. Families come in many different shapes and sizes, and it's no one particular shape or size that puts a child at risk just because of that constellation of families. What I believe very strongly is anytime a family is under stress, that is when a child is perhaps at risk. So if the family does not have the ability to be able to supervise the children because there aren't enough parents available, or because of financial stress, or because of domestic violence, or substance abuse, or mental health, any of those kinds of risk factors are going to make a child more likely to be abused or neglected. So it's not any one type of family or any one type of factor that causes child abuse and neglect, but certainly the more of those factors that we have present for a child and their family does put that child at greater risk for child abuse or neglect. So I guess I would like the church to not be judgmental of families, because children do not have choices about what kind of family they are going to be raised by and that they are born into. None of us choose our skin color. None of us choose the economic system that we are born into. But churches need to value children and families in whatever ways it is that they come, and help to make sure that members of that family are all of their needs are being met. I think of one family that I'm aware of where a parent experienced a very severe medical crisis, and the remaining parent had to juggle everything from their own employment to caring for the children to helping the other parent through the medical crisis. And I saw that as a situation where if there hadn't been a church family involved, that family may have fallen into a place where the children's needs were not met. But I saw the church gather around that family and be able to help to provide the child care, help to bring food, and help to raise what could have been a very, very difficult situation to one where the children continued to be cherished, and the family was able to return back to wholeness when they were able to get back into equilibrium, and the parent was no longer having ill health. It wasn't until I became a parent that I realized just what a tough job it really is. So in becoming a parent, it really raised my level of empathy for families. As I realized all the blessings that I had the church family, I had friends, I had a spouse, I had a house, everything was very stable, and yet parenting was still very hard. And it really helped me to raise my empathy toward these families. And I had to really take a pause, even from teaching parenting, which is what I was doing at that time, because I realized that all of the things, the pat and dry answers that I was teaching didn't always work. And the business of being a family is messy and is hard. And we need a community, I believe, around us to be able to help support us. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping the church will rise up to do, to be with those families during the goods and the bad times, during new births, during graduations, weddings, all those kinds of lifespan celebrations. If the church can just stand by that family, just like the church stood by my own, can really be able to help those children to grow and to thrive and get their needs met. We are not powerless. As faith communities, we can do so much to end child abuse and neglect. A first step is to acknowledge that abuse exists and that it exists in our own communities. We must move past brain work and into feet and hands work. In big ways and small ways, we must act. Children need our protection. They need us to speak up for them, to act on their behalf. A child's future can be shattered by abuse and neglect, or a child's future can be redeemed or preserved. You can make the difference. And then another one from page 139, it's shorter. The church that refuses to acknowledge the reality of child abuse and neglect is the church that places children at risk, and one that is likely harboring offenders. A church that turns a blind eye toward child abuse leaves itself wide open and its children vulnerable.